So we're here this morning at Our Lady of the Road Shelter in downtown South Bend with Dr. Margaret Pfiel, who's a professor in the Notre Dame Theology department and also really involved with the Catholic worker movement here in South Bend. We're going to be talking with Margie today about activism, the life of action, Hannah Arendt, Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker movement, joining movements, and how these philosophical and theological views fit into her life as an activist and Catholic worker in South Bend. Margie helped found the Catholic Worker House here in South Bend in 2003 and lives in solidarity with the poor in downtown South Bend, providing a wide variety of services and outreach and help and compassion to people in our community. So Margie, I am really excited to talk with you today about these issues. And I thought maybe to start, you could just tell us a little bit about the Catholic worker movement and your experience with it, especially for some of our students that might not know about it.
Yes, well, I'm excited to be here too, and happy to talk about the Catholic Worker. Dorothy Day and Peter Martin founded the Catholic Worker in 1933 in New York City. So in the context of the Great Depression, they were looking at the Catholic social tradition and saying, how can we live this out? Going back to Scripture and then through the teachings of the early church fathers and mothers and through the early documents of Catholic social teaching. Peter Martin talked about blowing the dynamite of the social teaching of the church, and they were committed to nonviolence, so I don't know how that metaphor applies directly, but metaphorically he meant, how do we really enflesh this and live this out and communicate it in a way that people understand? And so they started a newspaper, the Catholic Worker, that is still published and available for 1 cent a copy from the New York Catholic Worker even to this day, and started writing about practicing the works of mercy based on Matthew 25, when did I see you hungry and feed you, naked and clothe you? And people started coming to the door and saying, I need that, where do I find that? And so they began the first house of hospitality then, taking in folks who were in need and doing the work at hand, as Dorothy put it. And now there are over 180 houses, more or less, in the US mainly, but also in other countries. And I think a connecting strand among all of these houses of hospitality is practicing the works of mercy. And that can take different shapes in terms of commitment to activism and nonviolent resistance and direct aid to people who are struggling.
So how did you find yourself attracted to get involved with Catholic worker or called to get involved with Catholic worker?
I've long had an interest, I think pretty much my whole adult life, in walking alongside people who are struggling. When I was going to high school in San Diego, we had a social action religion course in which we took weekly trips across the border to Tijuana, and I ended up working with Jenny Murphy, the person who coordinated those trips, over a couple of summers when I was a student here at Notre Dame and went home. And then I was a Holy Cross Associate in Chile during the Pinochet years after my undergrad years at Notre Dame, so 87 to 89. When I took my first teaching job at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, there were 2 very active Catholic worker communities with which I associated and spent a lot of time. And that was from 99 to 2002. 9/11 happened, and I had already been thinking about the possibility of joining one of those 2 communities, but with 9/11, I really woke up the next day and had this conviction that I either needed to live in a monastic community committed to nonviolence and rooted in simple living and prayer together, or be part of a Catholic worker community. Those were the 2 options I could think of as a person of Catholic faith for living with others in an explicitly nonviolent way. So I did make plans to join a Catholic worker in Philadelphia, and then ended up coming back to Notre Dame to teach. And when I arrived here, there were a few people who had been thinking about starting a new Catholic worker community here in South Bend. There had been one for many years, and that was sort of waning, and there was a desire to start fresh. And they said, well, no, they couldn't find anyone to actually live in the house. And I said, well, I'd love to live there. And there was another person, Mike Baxter, another professor from Notre Dame, who said he would too. And then a third person, Ben Peters, came to join us. So we started our community in September of 2003.
Listening to your story, it sounds like you found yourself at this turning point when you were in Philadelphia, between going maybe a more contemplative, like withdrawing route to live in community with others, and practice nonviolence, but be less in the public sphere, to the route that you actually took, which is getting seriously involved in organizing these community services and moving to South Bend. Do you think that decision, was it intentional, or do you feel like you were maybe drawn on one road rather than the other? Do you have a sense now, looking back, about why you chose the path that you did?
Yeah, it's an interesting discernment process. I think through most of my young adult life, I was discerning religious life and never quite ready to make that commitment. And I look to Dorothy Day as a lay woman who made this commitment to life, simple living in community with others, rooted in prayer, combining the contemplative and the active in a beautiful way as a lay person. And I realized that was my vocation.
We've been reading Hannah Arendt in our class, and one of Arendt's big ideas is that a large part of our identity is constructed by the social, historical, material circumstances that we find ourselves in. But also, it's not the case that we're just this kind of like passive bit of clay that's being molded by our situations. How we react to those situations, the ways that we engage politically, the ways that we speak out about our situations, play a huge part in determining our identity and making us unique agents in the world. I was wondering, when you're looking back on your experiences, if there have been particular political actions or particular activities in the public sphere that you think have played this role for you, of helping you form your identity.
I think there definitely have. I mentioned the formative experience of crossing the border regularly and accompanying people who were really destitute and living a half an hour from downtown San Diego, which is a very wealthy community. That dichotomy was very formative for me, to witness that and to ask, well, what is God asking of me? What is God asking of us? And to begin to ask questions about globalization and the borders, the arbitrary borders between nation states. Where I lived in San Diego used to be part of Mexico not that long ago. And to see the disparities created through public policy it had a big impact. And I studied peace studies and Latin American studies and international relations as an undergrad. So I was actively exploring those questions. When I went to Chile, under Pinochet, those last 2 years of the Pinochet regime, to be working publicly with the Holy Cross Associates as part of the Catholic Church in a context where the Catholic Church was really the only institution left in Chilean civil society that could speak the truth about human rights violations, was also deeply formative. I realized then that most of my questions were theological. I had always had an interest in theology, but I realized, well, there are the public policy questions, but underneath that, there are these deeper issues about how God is drawing humanity back to God's self, thinking about the Thomistic understanding of exitus and reditus in the Summa. What does this journey, this pilgrimage with God and back to God look like, especially in the face of tremendous suffering? I worked with the families of the detained and disappeared when I was in Chile, and they were mostly women who lost loved ones and never heard from them again. And they were some of the most joyful people I've ever encountered, and that made a deep impression on me, how they could negotiate the tremendous pain daily, not knowing what became of their loved ones, many of them children, and be joyful. And For many of them, it was their faith commitment, and I felt encouragement with them to keep looking for God precisely in the darkness, precisely when I might be tempted to think of God as absent. And that has been helpful throughout my life. Coming back from Chile with all these theological questions, I ended up going to grad school for theology, but I think it was formative to see what is possible for, as a person of faith, to work with others in ecclesial community as part of civil society, to address these larger questions about justice, precisely as part of the mission of the church.
I want to follow up on this because I think one of the topics we've been talking about in our class recently is what makes somebody an activist, and I think we have this kind of view, probably from the way that media portrays activism, is it's just somebody that's protesting something in the public sphere. And I think we read Hannah Arendt, we read Dorothy Day, and we get a much more nuanced picture of what it is to be an activist, where it's somebody who is engaged enough in the real, like, political, material issues in their community to allow those issues to affect them, and to want to speak out on them, and to want to be involved in transforming them. But that can take a wide variety of forms, and sometimes the form of your activism might be just, reaching out in solidarity or comforting somebody who's going through this. I wonder if you've given some thought this general philosophical question of what it is to be an activist, and if you like the label, or maybe you think, like, that's really not the right kind of label for the kind of work or the kind of calling that that you're engaged in, or that people in Catholic work are engaged in. Have you thought about this at all?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I do tend to think of it theologically in terms of how God draws people. In baptism, every person is given charisms, gifts of the Spirit, precisely for the service of the church in the world. And whenever I see somebody who's passionately committed as an activist, I think, oh, how are they experiencing God in their lives? Where did that deep passion, that desire come from? And I always think of it in terms of the Spirit at work in the world, that this is the particular gift that this person is sharing with us. How can we receive that? In terms of the Catholic worker, I think of charism in that way too, that I mentioned that what attracted me was that here we have this lay movement of people drawn to a kind of monastic rhythm of life, of ora et labora, prayer and work, connecting the active and the contemplative lives. Dorothy Day's favorite saint was Thérèse of Lisieux, who was a Carmelite contemplative living in France at the end of the 19th century and practiced what she called the little way of love. And she would focus on the nun in her community who drove her crazy, and pray and love that person in prayer. And ordinary people around the world intuitively connected with Therese's little way of love, because it's something any of us can practice anywhere, anytime, in our ordinary rhythm. So it's available to workers of all kinds, wherever they find themselves. And that's the connection that Dorothy Day found too, that it fits well with the contemplative and active dimensions of the Catholic worker. To say, we may have a mountain of dishes to wash. How we wash them is the key. Yeah. Not the efficiency of washing them, but the spirit in which we approach that work. If we approach that work contemplatively out of love, and call to mind the people who have used these dishes, the people who helped bring this food to the table. She said, well, Therese's little way of love has a transformative power to affect revolution in the world if we were to practice it that way. So all of that to say, I think of this as undergirding meaningful activism to me. That's how I think about it, the connection between contemplation and action.
This is so interesting. I'm preparing for this interview, I tried to read a lot of Dorothy Day's old editorials to get a sense for what the philosophical views are that were underlying her projects. And I was really impressed, I think partly because in this class we've been talking about how these big ideas trickle down to life at Notre Dame, like life for university students. I was really impressed by the ways that Dorothy Day would reach out to university students in her time and try to, wake them from their dogmatic slumber and get them to think more meaningfully about the kinds of work that they're doing. There's a passage I really liked. I know you work at Notre Dame and have a lot of opportunities to interact with Notre Dame students. Wondered if you thought this passage was still relevant to our community. So here's something that Day wrote in a 1935 editorial in the Catholic Worker. She says, "In the present situation, when people are starving to death because there's an overabundance of food, when religion is being warred upon throughout the world, our Catholic young people still come from schools and colleges and talk about looking for security or a weekly wage. They ignore the counsels of the Gospels as though they'd never heard them, and those who are troubled in conscience regarding them speak of them as being impractical. Why they think a weekly wage is going to give them security is a mystery. Do they have security on any job nowadays? If they try to save, the bank fails. If they invest the money, the bottom of the market drops out. If they trust to worldly practicality, in other words, they're out of luck. What right has any one of us to security when God's poor are suffering?" I wonder what you make of this passage, and in particular if you think we focus too much in our higher education communities these days on preparing students for what Day might call a life of security rather than a life of meaning.
It's a great question, and I do walk with a lot of students who are asking these sorts of questions, and I asked them myself when I was a student. My father died just before I graduated from high school in 1983. And I remember coming back after my first semester at Notre Dame and talking with my parish priest and saying, "What am I doing?" When you ask the existential questions about the meaning of life, finishing the four-year college degree can seem somewhat trivial. And especially in the face of the suffering of the world, I wanted to go down to Tijuana and just spend my time there. And my parish priest, Mike Gallagher, with his Irish brogue, said, "Oh, you can't do that. You'll be going out half-baked into the world." And, I thought about that. I prayed about that. And I realized I needed more formation. And after that experience, and now many years later walking with students, I do take seriously the notion of charism as gifts of the Spirit, and that each person has them and needs to discern what those are. And for each person, there may be a different path to develop those. For some people, that may mean a certain kind of education and a certain length of education. And for others, that might not be for them at all. Part of the Worker that I find attractive is its grounding in personalism. So understanding each person created in the image of God and subject of human dignity. And with this particular vocational journey with God in the world. And that means that there isn't one right answer. And so I would be reluctant to go too far down the path that Dorothy was going, to say, well, if I might infer from that passage, therefore, just come join our Catholic worker community, leave school.
Yeah.
Could be one conclusion one could draw. I wouldn't go there with her. I think I would say, let me encounter you as a person who is asking these questions, and let's bring that to prayer and see how God is working in your life. And, for example, one of the needs in our community is preventive health care and also mental health care in particular. If there's a student who is drawn vocationally to study medicine and will then turn after that education to use those gifts and all of the skills for the good of everybody in their community, and particularly the people who don't have adequate access to quality health care. I would want to encourage that person to develop their gifts because society needs doctors. And I could say that about many different expressions of vocation. So education is not the enemy here. Mm-hmm. I think the underlying point that she's making is, to what am I attached? What kind of attachment is that? If I'm attached to material security in a way that doesn't allow me to turn fully to trust in God, that's a problem. I need, whatever vocational path I'm taking, I need to place my trust in God and to know that ultimately God does provide. To trust in God's providence is the invitation that I hear her issuing. That can take many different expressions, but it's a contemplative practice to cultivate trust in God's providence. And it's part of the commitment to solidarity with those on the margins at the heart of the Catholic worker.
I was wondering, so one way of thinking about this like vocation and education question, I feel like modern universities really emphasize choosing a vocation as like choosing a profession, like identifying yourself as a future physician or a future philosopher or a future theologian. And one way of listening to your ideas and to interpreting Day in this point is you can think of your profession as a means, but not an end. And the end might be, serving the poor. The end might be, being a participant in this movement that's trying to address justice issues in the community. That's the thing you're really aiming for, and when you're discerning your profession, you're just trying to figure out what role am I going to play in this much bigger project that needs a lot of different people acting together politically in order to realize this end. Is that how you kind of think about it, or?
Yeah. I think of vocation in a broad sense of really, how is God calling each of us in our lives? And the ultimate end for all of us is life in God, in God's reign. And if we do carefully discern our particular gifts and then work with others to develop those for the good of everyone, that can take many shapes. And so the proximate end might follow a certain, a certain career trajectory. But that can shift over time too. A person might start doing one thing and then end up doing something else, precisely because as they develop as a human person throughout life, they come to deeper awareness of what that particular vocational call looks like. And that awareness can shift over time. And I think that's how God works in people's lives. And the hope is that we would be growing as human beings and growing in and with God. So what we think when we're 23 about what our lives will look like, for most people probably isn't the way it will look when you're 43 or 63.
Absolutely.
So there has to be some room for growth and support in community for that process to unfold.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Catholic Worker as a movement. It was taken a few weeks ago. David Brooks wrote this editorial in the New York Times where he was noting that he thought young people, especially nowadays, are wary of joining movements. It's a little bit ironic to hear him say that when we see so many movements being really important in the political stage right now, like the Black Lives Movement. But Brooks, at least, is skeptical that young people really have this mentality of wanting to be part of an intellectual movement. So here's a passage from this March 1st editorial. He says, "We live in a startup culture where there's great prestige in being the founder of something, the lone entrepreneur who creates something new. Young people who frequently say they don't want to work in some large organization are certainly not going to want to subsume themselves in some pre-existing intellectual label, like, for instance, being a member of the Catholic Worker movement." Mm-hmm. I wonder if that's a trend that you've noticed, if you think people who want to live active lives and who want to discern and practice a vocation like you've described are still wary of identifying themselves primarily with being part of like an intellectual or faith group like Catholic Worker, or if you think Brooks is maybe being overly critical.
I think it's an interesting question. I can see why he would be asking it right now. I think when Dorothy Day and Peter Martin began the Catholic Worker, they weren't thinking in terms of starting a movement. Mm-hmm. They were thinking in terms of offering people like themselves, especially lay people, an opportunity to live out the teachings of the Church around justice in particular, the works of mercy fully. What does it look like to respond to this invitation in Matthew 25? And also the Sermon on the Mount was the guiding scriptural passage especially for Dorothy's approach to nonviolence, which was very significant during World War II when she was supporting conscientious objectors to war, Catholics who wanted to claim CO status and had a very difficult time doing that under the legal structures of U.S. society. And even within the church itself, didn't find much support for that effort. So she didn't think that she was starting a movement so much as creating space for this particular expression of vocation. And so I think about that today. When people come to our Catholic worker community to have dinner, I think they would probably be scared if we said, hey, you want to join our movement?
You're part of the movement now.
Right, and it would scare me. I would find that a little unnerving. But instead, you know, when people come to dinner, we talk about the Cubs and we talk about people's favorite potato salad recipes, what traditions they might have practiced in their families around Easter, Easter celebrations, that sort of thing. Very ordinary points of human connection. And I love it when people come to dinner and sit down at the table and they don't know who is who. We don't have questions of status, oh, this person's a professor or that person just walked in off the street. No, everybody is a child of God and can relate in that way with each other in dignity. Is it a movement? I'd like to think it's a movement of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And that out of that commitment to treating people with dignity, there are certain implications for how we engage in society. And so some Catholic worker communities would express that through active nonviolent resistance. So civil disobedience is a strong strand in the worker. Dorothy herself was arrested many times. Through the 1950s, for example, she was active in leading others to resist the invitation from the government to go into air raid shelters during air raid drills in preparation for a possible nuclear bombing of New York City. She purposely invited others to sit on park benches and wait to be arrested during these air raid drills because she said, you know, the government is practicing deception. If there is ever, in fact, God forbid, a nuclear attack on New York City, we're not going to be sheltered underground. We'll be annihilated. And to perpetuate the myth of surviving is to play into this terrible destruction wrought by the military-industrial complex in the US and then around the world. So she was offering a prophetic vision and willing to put her own body on the line for that. And some people would look at that and say, well, she had a hand in starting the peace movement that then, you know, led into the Vietnam War era. And yeah, she was certainly an active player. Did she think she was starting a peace movement? No, I don't think so. I think she was responding to the signs of the times as a person of conscience and inviting other people to respond in conscience too. And that was a very important witness, that she exercised her particular gifts in that way as a gift to the church and also our whole society. So when the US bishops wrote their peace pastoral in 1983, if you look at paragraph 117, they point to witnesses of nonviolence in our times in the 20th century, and they name Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mohandas Gandhi. So she went from being vilified by some in the church for her commitment to nonviolence during World War II to being lifted up as a moral exemplar in the 1983 Peace Pastoral. All that to say, a roundabout answer to your question, I suppose. I guess I'm not inclined to think in terms of movements as much as people responding in conscience to the signs of the times. And there can be certain issues in our times that really galvanize people of conscience who respond out of a moral commitment to the common good. And I see that especially around issues of creation care. So in response to Laudato Si, there's much more activism now and potential for a more active ecological movement than there has been, especially among people of faith, which is exciting.
It goes back a little bit to a conversation we were having just a few minutes ago, but about the little ways being an inspiration for days work, and this idea. I think sometimes we have this idea like a movement gets started when you issue a charter and you start holding like large scale meetings and you launch a big program. But then we look at the civil rights movement, about the peace movements. We see a lot of those got started organically, again, with just individual people responding in ways that seemed appropriate, but in these kind of like little ways to the circumstances that they found themselves in, and that together, like as a body, it just grew organically. I wonder, that seems to be how you're thinking of it?
Yes, and in community with others then, so others who feel similarly drawn, and then gradually a community coalesces to address a particular challenge or to live in a certain way. Dorothy Day said, well, the Catholic workers started when we were just sitting around the table talking and we put a pot of coffee on. And that really is how Catholic worker communities get started, even to this day. Not so much through hammering out a charter or setting out a list of ideological commitments, but in relationship and in response to, again, how God is drawing people through their own desires to work for the good together.
You might think, also just going back to how you might respond to the Brooks piece, that it's really not this like binary choice that anyone faces between like join or identify with a movement or don't.
Right.
It's more, there's no such thing as one static movement that takes place over long periods of time. It's about the people that are part of the community and their individual actions and callings and identities that together create this really dynamic system that somebody can't help but be a member of in some circumstances, but it's not maybe necessarily something that we make a really active choice to sign on for.
Right.
Is that also how you're thinking of it?
Yeah. How do we respond to this invitation of the Spirit? I think about a couple of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement came to visit earlier this year at Notre Dame, and they talked about not wanting to be identified as leaders of a movement, but holding a space for people to participate together. And another way of thinking about that is to become co-conspirators. Feminista Jones was interviewed after the Charleston shootings last year and said, what we need are not allies for racial justice, but co-conspirators. And really asking ourselves, are we willing to put our own bodies on the line in working for racial justice, all of us together? And that word co-conspirator, you can think about conspiracy in a negative sense, but you could also think about the root of spirit, breath. How do we breathe together? Ecologically, literally, we are all connected and need all of creation to survive together. And we're breathing the same air. How do we breathe the air of racial justice together? I think that that's a question of conscience that people of faith ask personally and communally together and make a commitment as co-conspirators, rather than a commitment to an ideological movement.
I love this idea of co-conspiracy. One final question, just because we're running short on time. If Notre Dame students wanted to start conspiring or wanted to become co-conspirators in something that might help improve South Bend or help them identify more with the local community that they live in, do you have practical advice? Ways that they could get involved with Our Lady of the Road or other organizations that could really use the help of students committed to an active life?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, for the Catholic worker, we would love to invite people for dinner. We have dinner every night at 6:30, and they could just get in touch, maybe email me or our community and let us know when they'd like to come. And I know for the other agencies in town, they all have volunteer coordinators who would love to receive them and be happy to orient them. So it might depend again on some discernment on the part of the student about how they'd like to be involved, but there is great need in the local community for mentorship of young people, for accompanying people who are elderly and disabled, for meeting basic needs, material needs, also spiritual needs. You know, we're constructing a chapel here at Our Lady of the Road, and one of our hopes is that it can be a place of healing prayer, that under the material needs that people manifest when they come here, there are these deeper spiritual hungers that not only guests but also volunteers have. And how can we create a space for people to encounter God in the midst of those spiritual needs together? So we would love for students to take part in that as well.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for your time this morning and giving us so many interesting and really practical ways of thinking about Dorothy Day and Hannah Arendt and these questions that we've been encountering in our course. And thank you for all of the amazing work you do to make this community just a more living presence for everyone here.
Well, thank you. It's been a delight to talk with you, and it's work that we all do here together. So thank you for being part of it too.